The Samuel O. Thier Chair of Surgery at the Harvard Medical School was named in honor of one of the great figures of modern medicine and healthcare, Sam Thier, who was a distinguished head of the Massachusetts General Hospital and then the head of Partners, a remarkable man, a giant of a guy. It is altogether appropriate that Atul Gawande is the holder of that chair. Atul is a surgeon in the Department of Surgery at the Brigham and Women's Hospital. He does general and endocrinology, or endocrine surgery, I think, to be more accurate. He is also a professor at the Harvard Chan School of Public Health. He is at Ariadne Labs, which he may explain to you. He also is the chair of Lifebox, which is a not-for-profit organization directed to improving the quality of surgery around the globe. He is the recipient of the Lewis Thomas Award for the best writing on science. He has written extensively in the New Yorker, as I'm sure all of you know. He has written 4 books, each and every one of which was on the New York Times bestseller list. And oh yes, he's a MacArthur Fellow too. So what can one say in introducing him? Well, from a layman's point of view, I think it's fair to say that the synergy of his talents is particularly apparent. And not least among those talents is his ability as a surgeon. Because in what he has written, he's made an effort to remove euphemism and replace it with clarity. He is probably a master of the procedure of jardinectomy. And finally, he strives to implant in the public discourse on healthcare common sense and honesty. Atul Gawande.
Thank you enormously, and I'm honored to be here and have a chance to talk to you. I wanted to start with one of my favorite pictures depicting healthcare, and if I can walk away from here, it'll let me look at it myself. And it is a picture that Greg Myers, who spoke earlier, published in the New England Journal, showing essentially 200 years of history of medicine in a single slide. It's the Mass General Hospital and its inpatient mortality rate and the cost for each person discharged alive since 1821. And what's fascinating about it is looking along at it, you come to understand that, there was a lot of death. It was bouncing around in the 8 to 10%, sometimes 12, 14% range. In the early part here, this is the early 19th century. And what is striking about it was there was just very little learning going on. If anything, the trend was that things were getting worse. You went to the hospital, there wasn't much that people could do. You came along into the 20th century, and there was a sense that there was some learning going on. You had discovered anesthesia. You had discovered antisepsis. And still, Lewis Thomas, one of my favorite writers, physician, poet, trained at Boston City Hospital before becoming the president of Memorial Sloan Kettering. He wrote a book called The Youngest Science, and in it he had a chapter detailing what it was like to be a resident, an intern, in Boston at City Hospital in the year 1937. Right in here, when healthcare was cheap and not terribly effective. He said, if being in a hospital bed made a difference, it was mostly the difference produced by warmth, shelter, and food, and attentive, friendly care, and the matchless skill of the nurses in providing these things. Whether you survived or not depended on the natural history of the disease itself, medicine made little or no difference. Now, that didn't mean the doctors were not busy. He was working one of those 120-hour work weeks like they used to. And you wonder, what was he doing? And he described that what he was doing was seeing every patient to make sure that he was not missing one of the handful of diagnoses that they could do something about. And so he described some of them. If you had a pneumonia, for the most part, there wasn't anything that you could do. Unless you had a lobar pneumonia with a streptococcus, and if you got a sputum sample, you would plate out the slide and you'd look at it under the microscope, and if you identified streptococcus correctly, you could give a rabbit antiserum that sometimes would reverse the pneumonia. If you had a patient losing their breath from congestive heart failure, well, then you could open up an arm vein, bleed them of a pint of blood, crush up some digitalis leaf to give it to them, and then administer oxygen by tent. If you were a really good historian and you had a patient who had developed early signs of paralysis, and you could really get their real story out of them, you might discover that it's syphilitic paresis in its early stage. And in its early stage, you could offer this very nice concoction of arsenic and mercury that, sometimes worked if it didn't kill you first. Now, in 1937, on this slide, the costs of care were, in the well under $1,000 per person per year in current dollars. But there wasn't that much that you could do. And so no surprise, in the 1940s, even into the 1950s, most people died at home. There wasn't any reason, if you were really sick, to go to the hospital. You didn't have great expectation that they could do anything. But that changed enormously through this period here, where you had this tremendous explosion of discovery from World War II onward. And you start to see it reflected in this climb of costs. And, this is the era where we got penicillin, antibiotics of all kinds. We got chemotherapeutic drugs, steroids. We got dialysis machines, major surgical procedures for everything from transplantation to open cardiac surgery. What's interesting is that that along the way, there wasn't an immediate drop in the mortality rate for people in the hospital. And I don't know exactly why that is. There probably was a learning curve trying these things out. Many people were now coming into the hospital because there was hope and they thought, we'll be able to do something. But then, once that learning curve happened, you started to see a steep drop in the mortality rate. This was an era where, for our 13 organs that we have as human beings, we enumerated now more than 60,000 different ways that those organs can fail. 60,000 different ways that diseases or conditions can harm us. And for those, we have discovered more than 6,000 drugs so far approved by the FDA and growing on a yearly basis. And more than 4,000 medical and surgical procedures. And our job has become to deploy that capability town by town to every person alive. And that's had a dramatic effect in so many ways on our society. We have added in the course of that century, from that middle part of the 19th century to where we are today, we have added more than 30 years to people's life expectancy. In 1990, the average life expectancy was 47. Today, the average life expectancy is closing in on 80. And that's pretty stunning. Most of that came from public health improvements. But starting around the 1950s, it was adding also years to life after age 65. Since 1965, we've added more than 5 years to people's lives and improved the productivity of people's lives after that age as well. So we've transformed many, many experiences, including the fact that by 1990, 83% of us spent our last phase of our lives in institutions, dying most of all in hospitals, second of all in nursing homes. And along that way, you can look at the other part of the story here, a skyrocketing amount of cost, a flattening amount of mortality gain, and here, just in these last 10 years, an almost straight up curve. In the last 10 years, the costs per person discharged alive went from $25,000 to $35,000 in a stretch where this curve was all but basically flat. And that's where we've been confronting and coming to terms with a whole nother meaning of what it means to be great at what we do. This is really the description of what do I as a doctor think I'm supposed to be great at? And it's, in some sense, we think of it as saving lives, but now it's a much more complex idea, which is what's our value? What is the outcome we're able to produce for a given amount of cost? And are we able to avoid suffering and infliction of harm? Now, the interesting thing, I think, along the way that's come out of the statistical sciences is the discovery of a huge amount of variability. And to me, where there's variability, there is hope. One of the things that's fascinating is that we're discovering that the places that have the most expensive care do not necessarily have the best results. And that's very interesting, because you can see places getting fantastic results that are among the least expensive. That gives me hope in a sense, because the whole argument that, well, if it were the case that the most expensive care was how you got the best results, we really would have to be having a death panel argument now. But we don't. And what I think we're finding from what I've called the positive deviance, the places that are producing better and better outcomes for less and less cost, is that where they're most like a system is where they seem to be most successful. By a system, I mean it's a place or a machine where the diverse components fit and work together in concert, like a car. If you're building a car, you know that having great components are not enough. And what's fascinating with us in medicine is we're obsessed with the components. We want the best drug, the best device, the best specialist. But we think very little about how they fit together. Don Berwick has spoken about this great thought experiment that someone years ago performed, which is to imagine what it would be like if you built the car the way we build things in medicine. So you do randomized trials, and you discover that what you want are Ferrari brakes and a Porsche engine and a Volvo body and a BMW chassis. And you put it all together, and what do you get? A very expensive pile of junk that doesn't go anywhere. And medicine, I think, can sometimes feel that way. The way that we begin to put a system together is about having the right parts at the right time in the right places and being able to see it go farther and faster than you'd otherwise get anywhere at all. And I don't think we have completely recognized that this is actually what innovation is. I think we were fooled by penicillin. 1929, penicillin was discovered, and it came to the world as a miracle. It was discovered in 1929 at St. Mary's Hospital, Alexander Fleming. It took a good 20 years before really people figured out how to mass produce it. There wasn't really the robust kind of pharmaceutical industry there is today. And so, people had to learn how to get it out in the world. So it finally arrived in the late 1940s into the ordinary communities, and it came like a miracle. And it was a miracle. It was a miracle in part because it wiped out an entire class of diseases, bacterial illnesses of all kinds, in the throat, in the bladder, skin infections, you name it, pneumonia, wiped it out in a way that people could never thought possible. But the other part of it that made it seem a miracle was it was so easy. It was an injection. And it made us think that the future of medicine was like that. It was going to be just an injection, and that was going to make the problems go away. We'd have an injection for cardiac disease. We'd have an injection for cancer. We'd have an injection for strokes. And so we invested in research and discovery to find the next injection, the next pill. And it did generate enormous medications of value, operations of value, devices of value. But the funny thing has also been how we've tried to put it together. One of my colleagues at Johns Hopkins had done an analysis where he looked at, for a pneumonia or for a heart attack or for other conditions, typical ones that come in the hospital, how many people did you require to take care of you if you had that condition? In 1970, it was 2.3 FTEs, meaning 2 full-time equivalents, usually nursing time, and then a little bit of time of a doctor to check in each day, help make a plan. Fast forward, same condition, we can do so much more on this scale. Survival's better, people survive longer and have more productive lives after these same conditions. And it's, by the end of the year 2000, it was 15 FTEs at Johns Hopkins for the same care. You had ultra-specialized needs. You had respiratory therapy. You had nutrition. You had a variety of people coming in to help make it go. And when you have 15 different people, you end up having to have a very different model of how you make things work. In the other model, you just needed the pieces to be there, and they kind of happened. Now you have 15 pieces, and they're disconnected, uncoordinated, not pointing in the same direction. My mother came to the Brigham, brought her here to have her knee replacement done. And it went well, 3 days, no complications. So I'm trying to be a good son. So I hang out with my mom. And I'm kind of bored. So I just start counting the number of name tags that come in the room and do something to my mother. They either are executing on an order or they are making an order that changes the care. 63 people. And I'm not counting the radiologists. I'm not counting, there were 8 different physical therapists, for example. And you could have a situation where the physical therapist comes in the morning and they say, "What are you doing in bed? You should be out of bed." Get you out of bed. And the afternoon person comes and says, "What are you doing out of bed? You should be in bed." There's the difference between people who are pointed in the same direction and people who are not. We've trained, hired, and rewarded people in medicine to be cowboys. But arguably, it's pit crews that we need. I think we've come through a century powered by the molecule, which has been an incredibly important force. Reductionism, reducing things to their component atomic parts, is how we made innovation in the 20th century. It led us to recognize the gene, the neuron, the specialist, the super specialist who only does redo right knees. But what we're discovering now in the 21st century is that we have entered the century of the system. And it's got enormous complexities. The neuron does not predict the disease. It does not tell you what behavior is, why people's identity change. It's how the neurons map together and are structured that lead to behavior, to identity, to consciousness. And in genetics, we now have to think about gene networks and epigenetics and the ways in which the gene networks are structured and influenced to produce outcomes like disease or wellness. And it's very similar when it comes to the drugs, the devices, and the specialists. It's how they come together to produce their outcomes that can have enormous differences in whether the result is better care or worse care, whether someone gets better or not. And I think it's a fundamental reconception for innovators. We're needing to learn how to transform an industry from delivery of components to delivery of systems that enable better decisions about how to use the components and achieve better results, best results. It's moving from being technology-based to being knowledge-based. I think medicine has been in the grip of a fundamentally flawed idea about how we make our systems work. If there is a discovery, a new drug, a new way of taking care of asthma, a new way of taking care of people, what we do is we say, you guys, you should do this. And we train you. That's the most primitive level, I think. Now, when it doesn't work, when you see the variability and people aren't doing what they're supposed to be doing, all that, then we say, you know what? You must do X. You must give this drug, you must wash your hands, you must do this, that, and the other. And so we issue guidelines. We threaten to sue you, malpractice law. We have regulations. We sometimes try to be nice about it, and we give you pay for performance. But it's all amounting to the same thing. And we all learn how to game all of those measures, right? We learn how to work our way around them. But stage 3 is where doing X, doing the right thing, doing the thing we know how to do, is just the norm. It's easier than not doing it. And that only happens when you've built it into your systems. That means, the simplest system that I've ever been able to find is just a checklist. But there are many, many different kinds of systems. There are defaults, there are measurement, feedback loops. There's other kinds of systems that we're learning to begin to create and deploy in healthcare. And we don't have that many innovators trying to think through how to create these. But the value can be enormous. We were asked in our team now 6 years ago, 2007, 7 years ago, 8 years ago, by the World Health Organization to help them tackle a problem where they'd seen an enormous rise in the volume of surgery in the world. It's actually now, so it's at about, back then we measured it at almost 250 million operations a year done worldwide, more than there were childbirths, but with death rates 10 to 100 times higher, most of which we thought were avoidable. And the puzzle was, what could we do to try to reduce these deaths? We brought in a team from Boeing and ended up zeroing in on using a checklist-based approach, trying to make a simple system that teams could use. It identified 19 common failures and asked surgical teams to walk through a team checklist to communicate at the before incision whether the patient, you are the right patient, the right side of the body, but also, do we have the right plan for blood or any other resuscitation in the room? Before the incision, not only have we given an antibiotic, but has everybody identified themselves in the room? Has the surgeon spoken up about what the goals are of the operation? How long the case will take? How much blood loss the team should prepare for? Has the anesthesiologist talked about the medical issues of the patient? The nurse discussed the equipment and infection concerns and anything else they think might be important, and only then proceeding. And then another set of checks like that before they leave the room. We deployed it because our hypothesis if it was not turning people's brains off but turning them on, then it should increase awareness of what to do, remembering to do it, organizing when to do it, emphasizing a daily focus on quality, enabling supervisors to know what are the priorities and making sure they're being done, and also making sure that critical resources and supplies are in place, that the operation should not be done without them. We worked with the WHO to test it, and it's the World Health Organization, so that the aim was we were going to test in the poorest places in the world, so it wasn't surprising we went to rural Tanzania and a crushed city hospital in Delhi and in Manila and in Amman, Jordan. But we argued with them that this should be tried in the richer parts of the world too. Even with the places donating funds to participate in the trial, 87% of the budget went to Seattle alone. But it was worth it because in the end, after we deployed it, every site had a reduction in their complications. The average reduction was 35%, 36%. The average reduction in deaths was 47%. If you just took out the low-income parts of the world, the 4 rich countries, it was still a 30% reduction in complications. It's since been, it's spread around the world. We have about 50 million of the world's 300 million now operations done worldwide that we estimate that it's being used in since our publication 6 years ago. And part of what's interesting about it is trying to understand how do you deploy this kind of capability. The VA deployed it across 74 hospital systems by having everybody shut down their OR and do a day of team training around using this new approach. It takes an effort to be able to make this work. And they successfully proved, compared to controls, that they dropped their mortality rate 18%. Is there a drug you could give to surgery patients that would drop their mortality rate 18 to 47% in demonstrable trials? I mean, we would be billionaires. But it's just a checklist. It's just a system. In Scotland, they deployed that system not by shutting down the ORs. They mandated it as part of regulatory law. Unlike in Canada, which mandated it in Ottawa as a regulated law, they also provided on-site support. So they visited each place, they asked, what are the troubles you're having, walked them through how to adopt it, first in one place and then another, and then gave them feedback on how well it was going. In Canada, they didn't do that. In Canada, there was no effect on mortality. No surprise, I think. In Scotland, since the program started at the end of 2008, they've now gotten below 0.5% inpatient mortality, something I really haven't seen across a large population. A 25% reduction in deaths. They count 9,000 lives saved from this effort. We've been rolling this out, trying to make it work in low-income countries where the challenges are different. Some of the safety equipment is extremely expensive, and we had to engage in ways that you lower the costs for those low-income environments, and we've had to create a coalition of professional societies to do voluntary training of anesthetists around the world, but have successfully upgraded conditions in 25 target countries, so 90% of their ORs have improved conditions, and we're confident we've improved safety for about 10 million patients. What we see is that as you're trying to bring systems into place, you're constantly battling with this question of the intensity of implementation you're trying to drive and the amount of improvement that you can have and how much touch is required to get there. And it's taken us a while, but we've slowly been mapping how much is needed for this one little thing called a surgery checklist. That the deployment, you can certainly get there with weekly support, as we did in the trial. But, a mandate with a day of team training or even volunteer coaching, touching base with people remotely in countries around the world once every 3 months and walking them through it and doing an occasional site visit allowed us to get pretty far with something like Lifebox. We know just handing out a piece of paper and telling them you better do it doesn't do much. The value and the places that we're going here is that I think we know that systemness, to coin a phrase, is achievable. Research and development about finding the systems that work and reduce the intensity required for adoption is where we have to be able to go as a group of researchers and innovators. Different places are harder to implement than others, and context makes it very different. But tools There are software approaches, there's coaching techniques, there are training techniques, there are pathways that make it easier to climb the curve. And that's what we've been trying to discover in the work that we've been doing in what's now a lab that I've formed. One of the things that strikes me is that we haven't yet bought, for example, the pharmaceutical industry in on this. And yet, this is a world where in a drug trial, as I was talking to someone earlier, an asthma drug trial trying out a new drug, one of the first things that people in pharma do who are doing a multi-center trial is they want to make sure that the quality of the asthma care is decent, because you don't want to just stick a drug in a place that's doing all the asthma care badly. So they end up training the doctors in how to raise their asthma care, and the result is in both the control group and the intervention group, the quality improves substantially. Then they add the controller drug, and yeah, it makes things a little bit better. And then everybody throws all that other stuff away and hands out the drug. But how about that package you just created? That is of enormous value and could be something that could scale. Now, when I talk to people in the pharmaceutical industry, they often puzzle, like, how do we turn that into a product? It's not obvious. And then I met a guy from Eli Lilly who who's the CEO of one of their subsidiaries. His name is Bill Weldon, and he runs Elanco, which is the animal division of Eli Lilly. And in Elanco, they have 8 products for cows, 8 drugs. But what they also sell is analytics for large animal producers to know, how do I know how well my population of cows are? How do I know when to use these medications or not? And by the way, now the analytics have gotten so powerful, they're tracking 400 different kinds of conditions these cows have. Most of the time, the conditions don't need Eli Lilly's products at all. They're recommending other products for other folks. But that tool is more valuable and is more profitable for Eli Lilly than the drugs themselves. Bill Weldon said, I don't detail products now. We detail how to improve the outcomes for the customers. Moving from being able to detail, more to the point, sell outcomes instead of products. That is the next stage, I think, of innovation. And that's what we formed our lab, Ariadne Labs, to do. It's a health system innovation center that we put together with the School of Public Health and the Brigham and Women's, but have people from all across Harvard and the hospitals. And we've been working in 3 specific areas: in surgery and what systems can improve surgical care, childbirth, how you come into the world, and then interestingly in the last couple of years, the end of life, how you leave this world. And I'm aware I'm running out of time, so I won't go into it in great detail. But I'd say, what was interesting in deciding to tackle the end of life is it's clearly the hardest one that we had to take on. It's the problem of that 83% who spend their last days institutionalized and don't necessarily want to. And yet it's unclear what to do. And the investigation that I had in the course of writing the book was to talk to more than 200 patients and families about their experiences with serious illness, but then also palliative care experts, nursing home workers, hospice nurses, and learn there was some skills, some basics, a kind of checklist that they follow for what they do differently, what things I might do differently next week when I have a seriously ill patient that we could learn to deploy. So at the most basic level, we in medicine and society fail to recognize that people have priorities to serve for them besides just living longer. They have what I called loyalties. They live for something larger than themselves. Sometimes it's their children, sometimes it's their work, sometimes it's God, it's justice, it's their country. But it's important to know what that is. The only way to know what that is, because that's what they want you to serve. The only way to know is to ask them, but we don't ask them. We ask less than a third of the time. But the third who are asked, in astounding trials, including one at the MGH, people who get that early palliative care discussion end up stopping aggressive therapy sooner, fewer days in the hospital, less likely to die in the hospital or the ICU, home on hospice for longer, less suffering at the end of life. And the extraordinary thing was that they lived 25% longer, because it wasn't bad decision making to take something as a last-ditch effort that was only toxicity and harm. And the secret was how to bring that to a whole institution. And that's an example of the kind of discovery that I think is absolutely necessary. We've turned it into, when I went around, I'd say to a palliative care doctor, what is it that I should be doing differently next week? What is my checklist? I talked to hundreds. Actually, it was Susan Block at the Dana-Farber, who was the one who gave me like a crisp checklist. And I wrote it down, and it's morphed, and it's now here. And we're deploying it in a trial at the Dana-Farber and at the Brigham in a randomized trial across the facilities. And it is understanding that the key is to ask people, what's your understanding of where you are with your illness? What are your fears and worries for the future? What are your goals if your health worsens? What are you willing to sacrifice, and what are you not willing to sacrifice? What outcomes are not acceptable to you? And does your family know the answers to these questions? We've been deploying this and testing this, and I think it's a demonstration that even on these really seemingly soft, hard issues, you can do real science that has value by creating outcomes. The trial has now involved 80% of the clinicians of the Dana-Farber. We've enrolled thousands of patients. We followed them through to the end of their life. We don't reach our final endpoint for another year. But I'll tell you from our early data, we're already confident that we're seeing conversations in the control group that occur less than a third of the time. And people are having these conversations more than double the time. We're seeing more conversations. They're happening earlier, and they are better, with significant reductions in anxiety for people who have these conversations. Conversations that they fear having and yet feel better about, doctor and patient alike. Those are the kinds of opportunities I think innovation can create. We're trying to learn how to make it viable to finance that kind of work. But I think that the future, whether it's in pharmaceutical work or device work or in just making how our hospitals and clinics run, the future is going to be understanding how we deliver on outcomes and not just products. Thank you. Two, okay. Time's okay? Time's okay? Okay. So we are taking questions. They tell me I've got a thingy here, and you guys are somehow, telekinesis is beaming your thoughts to me right here. So how can we educate doctors to be better at realizing that the death of a patient is not a personal defeat? No question, the first patients I had who died, I thought I had lost. It was impossible to not feel that it's a failure. And I think that a fundamental aspect of it is first understanding that the mortal lifespan is the normal lifespan and that it isn't a defeat. I couldn't understand how to get there until I incorporated these basic concepts in my mind, which is understanding what people's goals are if their health worsens. Understanding what matters most to them. I had this conversation with my father, and I chronicle it in the book. He developed a astrocytoma of his brainstem and spinal cord, and it was in a place they couldn't remove it, and so it just grew and grew. And I sat with him to ask those questions. I went through those questions with him. And along the way, we talked about what was most important to him, and I had mentioned a colleague whose father said that for him what mattered most was, at a minimum, if he could still watch football on television and eat chocolate ice cream, that was good enough for him. And my dad said, that's not good enough for me. For him, it was sitting around a dinner table with friends or family and being able to interact. Even if it's just once a week, that would be enough for him to live for. But if the therapy took that away or the disease took that away, let him go, that wasn't going to be good enough. And now we knew what to fight for. And as I've asked my own patients what they think about, I don't feel like the death has become the defeat if I haven't helped them achieve at least what those goals might be. So towards the end, it was first, can we keep my dad going for having that meal and seeing people? And then the last 3 weeks, when that wasn't possible anymore, it became clear that pain control was what his top priority was. And the only time I felt ineffective were the couple of times when we flinched at the switch and we did not make pain his priority and let him experience pain because we were afraid of losing him, because his breathing would stop sometimes when we give him the medication. But it felt like no defeat at all, that we managed to make a good life all the way to the very end. And that, I think, should be our goal. Our goal, of course, is health and independence, but we get lost when health and independence are no longer possible. And then it should be, I think, that basic idea of a good life as possible all the way to the very end. Let's see what this other one. Should there be a checklist directed to patients? For example, make sure your meds and allergies are correct, et cetera. Yes, there is one from the Agency for Healthcare Research and Quality put out a checklist for patients that's actually been pretty popular and interesting, which is your checklist for going to the doctor. I don't know how well quantified and measured it is. It seems very useful and practical and seems kind of obvious that they would be really beneficial. But I definitely get contact a lot by patients about what would be my checklist that could really save my mother's life in the hospital. What are the 5 things I should be doing while she's in the hospital to take care of her to be effective? And actually, there are teams right now at the Brigham and at the MGH doing research on exactly these kinds of things. For example, David Bates runs a program where families in the ICU and on the floors are getting iPads where they get to track the goals that the doctors have and add goals themselves for the patient and see what milestones and aims everybody's trying to achieve. And then find that they can pitch in, like if one of the goals is to keep the head of bed up to avoid the patient aspirating, they can notice if the bed was put down and the nurse forgot to put it back up again. Or if certain things were supposed to happen that didn't happen, and then could alert people along the way. And they're actually, for the first time, studying whether that kind of work really does reduce the number of errors and perhaps even improve the outcomes along the way. And there's a variety of those studies going on with these iPad-based and software-based approaches. Let's leave it at that. Thank you.